I guess I could say I think the debate is over and I won. He's come so far over to what I've been arguing and presented it so well that it took many of my arguments right out of my mouth. But I am going to take my debate time and try to use it well. I think Glenn is doing a marvelous job of rehabilitating John Muir, showing in new ways how we might think about him in ways that make him relevant. When I argued, when we met with a reporter from the LA Times and had a kind of debate around a table in Glenn's office, and I argued that Muir is no longer relevant. And the reporter quoted me on that accurately. And then I went on to say, in words that afterwards I might have thought about rephrasing differently because they really did upset people. And I understood that, and I felt bad about that, and apologized publicly for that. Because it was hurtful. When I said it's after 100 years it's time to bury his legacy and move on, I was quoted accurately, but I think it was maybe it was an intemperate thing to say, I was to a certain extent playing the devil's advocate. In a debate, and it's something that we do all the time in academia, and it's one of the great things about school, classrooms, whether it's the classrooms in your school or the classrooms in a graduate seminar in the university, where you can test out ideas in a safe space, where you can say things that you might not, you're still trying to work your way towards ideas, that you can say things that you might not fully feel confident about, but you can debate them. Or you can take a really strongly held position and argue it. We can have an argument, and it can be really intense argument about John Muir and his legacy and whether it's relevant anymore. And we can disagree strongly, and then we can, walk out and, go have a meal or a drink together and be friends and colleagues, and and continue on. And that's a really valuable part of the academic and educational culture that we don't really we don't have in much of the rest of our society, and particularly not online, in the comment sections, where I was, I think I can say these things, that where I was called a giant douchebag on Reddit, a jackass on Twitter. And then a guy called me on my phone that day and said, see, he and some of his friends had been talking, and he just wanted me to know, it sounded like an elderly gentleman, he said that they were not going to let me destroy the planet. I was like, okay, good, I'm glad, But, I came, I knew this, but I don't think I had fully realized, that, as Glenn said, there's a reason why we say there are places that are sacred, like Yosemite, or that John Muir is the patron saint of environmentalism. And when you question those things that have that kind of sacredness to them, be careful. What I want to talk with you a little bit about, and here I want to get a little bit academic, but I think it's something that's really important, and it's not that abstruse. I want to talk about the difference between heritage and history, and in a way in which heritage is also connected to how we think about legacy. So heritage and heritage institutions, often like local community museums or cultural centers or genealogical societies, and much of what we see around us often as a kind of public history is really about heritage. And that's the way in which we as communities or groups or societies, the state, California, environmentalists, tell stories about ourselves and our history that make us feel good, that empower us to feel proud about our heritage, where we come from, where we're going. And that's what we as historians think of as heritage, which is very different from history. History is, the way that we think about history is a discipline. And history, we sometimes say, is argument without end. It's always unfinished. There are always questions, new questions that we're asking about history, about the sources, about the context of someone like Jon Muir. New information comes to light. We understand him in different ways. And history is complicated. And Glenn did a good job, I think, of complicating Jon Muir and his history for you. He showed a lot of those complications of the man. Jon Muir was a complicated man. He was not only a wilderness and nature advocate for parks. He was a rancher and an orchardist in Martinez. He ran a big agribusiness. He became, by marrying into a family that had a big ranch and orchard in Martinez, a wealthy man. He hung out with wealthy people. He was friends of the industrialists and the railroad barons of his time. He convinced the railroad to build a station, a stop, on his ranch so that he could get goods to market more efficiently. This is part of the complicated history of the history of the man, and I think it's an important one to understand. And although some people accuse me of many things, one of which they accused me of was wanting to forget that history. I'm a historian. Far be it from me to want to forget that history. I actually want to understand that complicated history, and I think Glenn's done a good job of showing it. What I was arguing, and what I would still argue, is that while history is complicated, heritage is often very, very simple, and often, sometimes anyway, counterproductive for understanding the complications of our history and, more importantly, our times. I think the heritage or the legacy of Jon Muir that I find counterproductive, and Glenn has alluded to many of these things, is that the California that we set up, the California that Muir set up, is one of the cities where it's a tripartite California. It's one where people live in the cities. He wasn't, this is the work, the vision that's sort of set out in Jon Muir's public writings, really. So that, the cities that he wasn't very fond of, where people lived, the economically productive landscape of farms and ranches and mines, and then the cathedrals of nature. And, we still live in that California, really. But it's changing. And I don't think that the way that that's set up as these kind of zones of California, divided, into these zones of California, is very helpful for understanding our relationship with nature. We're increasingly seeing, of course, that there's nature across that spectrum. There's nature in the cities and the ways that we depend on clean water, clean air, that is provided by nature, the parks and the biodiversity that we're increasingly discovering, understanding in Los Angeles, that the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles is very involved in studying and helping to connect people to. And I've come from Northern California, and I've only been here 2 years, but it always amazes me to come up to Topanga Canyon. And not tonight when it took a little bit longer, but it's only what, half an hour away, I mean, at most. And just to see the way in which even in Los Angeles we think of, the city is all imbricated with nature throughout it. We see the way in which nature is such an important part of farms and ranches, the ecosystem services, as we call them, that pollinators and others, provide to other aspects of nature, provide to making the food that we depend on. And then we also see that there's culture that runs across that spectrum too. That the wilderness, the parks, even wilderness itself is a human creation. It's a cultural creation. People created the laws that protected and still protect and administer and manage those areas. And so there's an important part of culture that runs across that spectrum too. And I don't think that Muir's way of thinking helps us really understand that in ways that help us today. The other, very fundamental, I think, kind of heritage and legacy of Jon Muir is this separation of people and nature. I think it's, similarly, we're really thinking about that in different ways. And as Glenn said, this model of, the lone guy in the wilderness, with a crust of bread, in his pocket, climbing a tree in a windstorm and exulting in the power of nature. It's a wonderful image, but it's not the only way to relate to nature. I want to just show you something, a couple of things. I think it's time for a new vision for parks and nature. And so I kind of want to run through, this is some things that I work on, and it's part of what motivates me to argue that I think we should, there are new ways of thinking that Muir doesn't really help us much with. This is a picture of all of the Instagram photos taken in parks around Los Angeles last year, and it's a heat map. So the red areas are where there are more Instagram photos created. And the way that we created this visualization and harvested them was we actually took the photos that have the geographic location on them, the latitude and longitude, and then mapped them. And it's a part of a project that we've been doing on parks, where my colleagues at Stamen Design in San Francisco, we work together on this research project, looking at all the social media that emanates from parks, Instagram, Flickr, Twitter, and Foursquare check-ins. And we ranked the parks by their sort of popularity on social media. And and then we displayed that on this website. And what we discovered is that you showed that in some ways, I mean, Muir also had this, but in contrast to the image of the lone guy in the wilderness, parks are social. people do all kinds of things in parks that they do in the rest of their lives. They take selfies, they share them, they take pictures of their friends, they take pictures of their landscape, they comment on it, and sometimes they share too much information, particularly on Twitter. We found that parks are social, and that's a really powerful thing to think about. As we think about the need to create and to engage new constituencies in parks, if parks are social, we don't have to gin that up. We don't have to create that. It's already there. It's already happening. And I told this story to a deputy director of the National Park Service when I was back in Washington, D.C. in the fall, and she said, yeah, it's like these people are having a party over here, and they're talking about us, and we're not going to the party. So the parks, as Glenn pointed out, are still trapped in this old way of thinking, although they know there's this new conversation and this new party going on. And so they need to figure out how to be part of it. Because parks, the National Park Service, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary next year, state parks in California, conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and others, they look at these demographics and they realize that they're in danger of losing a whole generation of people. And those are, your students and my students in college now. And if they don't have that, if that generation doesn't come up as people engaged and supportive of parks and of conservation, we're really in big trouble. But this shows that in many ways they are engaged. They're talking, they're participating. So how do we participate in that? The other thing that this shows is one of the barriers that the Parks Forward Commission in California has identified to people diverse Californians going to parks, is that they don't think that they will see people like themselves in parks. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, it's less likely they will than in the rest of the population, but I also think that's a legacy of Jon Muir. That's a legacy of the idea of the way that you go to nature and parks, and people have told me this. It's like, why are you doing this stuff about social media? You're supposed to leave that stuff behind. You're supposed to go alone into nature. That's the way to do it. It's one way to do it. It's not the only way. And what social media shows is that diverse Californians will see people like themselves in parks, and if you can show that, it's an invitation. The other aspect of this, we're the Yosemite. There's some of the Twitter. We've worked with our colleagues in groups like Outdoor Afro, which is trying to change that image, and Latino Outdoors, and what we also know about this new generation is that, and this comes from something that John Jarvis, the head of the National Park Service, once said in a hearing here in California of the Parks Forward Commission that is looking at how to reinvigorate state parks. He said they found that this new millennial generation that they're really concerned about losing, that they don't like to be spoon-fed information. They like to discover things. Their way of learning and engaging is discovery, and I think that resonates with some of the work that you're doing at the school, and your approach there. And John Jarvis said, and we've been spoon-feeding people information for 100 years. So it's really hard for us to change this. And I think it's part of this legacy of Jon Muir, that there's this one sacred way of relating to nature. And if people don't do it that way, it must be because they don't care or something. And I think if we ask people whether they care, whether they have a relationship with nature, we will find that all people do. And that the thing that we need to do now is to ask the question and listen. So we're working to develop an app that is going to launch. You're among some of the first people publicly to hear about it in a couple of weeks, called caliparks.org, which will be a way to discover parks near where you are or where you're going to be today, where you can do things. It's based on the user experience and the user discovery of that. That's going to be part of a bigger effort to build a constituency and engagement in the future among this very diverse, millennial, technologically savvy, socially engaged generation for parks. And I would just leave you with, because I also like to think not just about our own backyard in California, but about the global significance of it. This is a map of the world of 7 billion people. We know that the population is probably going to increase to 9 or 10 billion over this century. Most of that growth is going to end up in cities. That means that cities are going to double. And I'm sorry, this is really small, so you can't see it, but I'll describe what it is. Most of that population is going to end up in cities, all of it effectively, so that the urban population on Earth is going to double in the next 40 years, in the times that a great deal of this audience will still be alive to see that. Because that urban population is going to double, that actually means that the urban built environment is going to double. And how that happens is really fundamentally going to determine how we live with each other, how people live with each other, and how people live with nature on Earth. What we see when we look at these trends is, yes, there are big impacts of that, but this is also, and this was from National Geographic, an increasingly literate population, and an increasingly connected population. And so there are all kinds of opportunities for education, for storytelling, for communicating in a world in which people are very connected. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to think about as we think about the future of our relationship with nature here in Topanga Canyon, or the LA area, in California, in the United States, or in the world. Thanks.